We are ready to begin this second panel for today. We have two speakers, Ms. Dragica Tadic-Papanikolaou. She was born in Valjevo, Serbia. She has studied theology at the Theological Faculty of the University of Belgrade. She earned her first master's degree in theology from the Theological Faculty of Athens. She is currently attending the master's program of the St. Sergius Orthodox Theological Institute in Paris. Her research field specialization is the development of the liturgy in the ancient church in the modern hagiography. Since 2004, she is a fellow worker of the Christian Cultural Center in Belgrade. The subject of her presentation is the construction of national idea and identity through the church narratives. I hope that she will follow the time limit, but we are charitable and will give her 5 minutes more if she needs them, since she has already asked for that. The second speaker is Reverend Dr. Cyril Hovron. He was born in Ukraine. He studied theology at the Theological Academy of Kiev. He earned his BA at the University of Athens and a Master's of Arts and PhD from the University of Durham in the UK. His topic was Theological Controversy in the 7th Century Concerning Activities and Wills in Christ. He is currently teaching patristics at the Theological Academy of Kiev, and he was invited to teach and lecture in many institutes, theological faculties and seminaries in Russia, Europe, Asia, and the United States. He is also the Vice Rector of the Postgraduate School of the Russian Orthodox Church. He has also been the first Deputy Chair of the Committee for Education of the Russian Orthodox Church from 2009 to 2012. We have met numerous times in various ecumenical conferences. He is a good friend, and let me immediately give the floor to Ms. Tadic-Papanikolaou. Thank you very much. My subject is the construction of national idea and identity through church narratives. I have some specific examples from the Balkans, from the 18th to the 19th century, and some more from the beginnings of the 20th century. Of course, we will focus on the Orthodox Church and will try to reach some conclusions. Since the 16th century, the European society has undergone radical changes that will lead to modernity. Some important factors in these changes are the invention of printing that has changed language and facilitated communication. Later on, the Industrial Revolution and the evolution of the capitalist system. All these factors together have brought to the forefront the concept of the nation and also the construction of modern nation states. The modern state, nation state, is at some point secular, but at the same time needs a theoretical background. The synthesis between these two needs has led to the creation of a secular religion, which we will call the religion of the nation. In this new European religion, ecclesiological concepts were replaced by nationalist nation concepts in order to create a tradition. We have liturgical celebrations that become public celebrations, that we later have public monuments that are important for the nation's history. Therefore, we have replaced eschatological recollections with the nation's history. The European movements in that era affected the people of the Southeast Europe, which was at the time part of the Ottoman Empire. However, the models in the creation of national idea and identity in the Balkans were not very much different from the European counterparts. In many of these circumstances, many of these cases, the Orthodox Church participated either because this was necessary due to outside circumstances, or because the Church decided by itself to participate. The first nation-state in Southeast Europe was the Greek state. In order for the Church to aid in the creation of this national identity, the Greek Orthodox Church becomes a national church. This is first seen in the administrative level, having an autocephalous church, but then this autocephalous church was integrated in the administrative machinery of the state. Initially, there was a conflict between the ideas of the people, which was also expressed by the people of the church, but the future Greek leaders understood that it was impossible to create a modern European state if they would not bridge the difference between the new and the traditional, and in order to create a new ideology and new institutions to govern the new state. That led to a change in the Church's narrative in order to aid in the construction of a national identity. I will give you the example of a very well-known work, The History of the Greek Nation, written by Konstantinos Paparigopoulos and first published in 1853. In that work, we have started to use the term Helleno-Christianism. And Christian concepts become historical concepts. The history of salvation becomes a history of national awakening. We have also the concept of a Greek Middle Ages empire, which was having Constantinople as its capital. The chosen people become the Greeks, and the Church's mission is salvaging the nation. Furthermore, there can be no church without Hellenism. So these new church narratives were used to create a new ideological basis and help in the creation of a Greek national identity. Of course, this, however, had tragic consequences for the Church. The Church was identified with a state, and the state's aims and objectives became the Church's objectives. Of course, this led to an identity crisis inside the Church, which continues to be evident and obvious in its liturgical life. We have celebrations of the Church that are linked to specific historical events. For example, on the 25th of March, are we celebrating the Annunciation or the beginning of the Greek War of Independence? At the same time, the Greek Orthodox Easter is celebrated characteristically in the Greek state. So, at very large extent, at a dangerous level, the liturgical life of Christ of the Church of Christ was substituted to the practical expression of the nation's history. Now, let's turn to Bulgaria. The modern Bulgarian state was founded in 1878. However, building the national identity in the nation began a century earlier with Paisios of Hilendar, who published the work that is considered the gospel for the Bulgarian national awakening. It is the Slavonic Bulgarian history. It is the first historical work of Bulgaria written in the Bulgarian vernacular. He refers to the Middle Age history of Bulgaria in order to create a national identity. His successor, Sophronios from Vratsa, went one step further in the struggle for the creation of an autonomous Bulgarian church. In other neighboring countries, like in other neighboring countries, the Enlightenment helped in the Bulgarian national awakening. Since the end of the 18th century, the Bulgarians have been fighting to educate their people in the vernacular objecting and rejecting the use of Greek language and culture. Therefore, it is not surprising the fact that the first Bulgarian nationalists would appear inside the church. And the renewal of the autonomous Bulgarian church became an important issue for them. The development of the Bulgarian national movement was very well described yesterday by Mr. Stamatopoulos as well, so I will not repeat what she said. Let me just say, like Mr. Leshin said, we heard about the example of Romania, so I will not even go into that. But let me underline that in other Balkan countries, the road to church autonomy was a little bit more smooth than the case of Bulgaria. However, it was always linked to national awakening and the creation of a nation-state. Let's say that it was considered an important and a necessary ingredient of the creation of a nation-state. All churches in the Balkans followed the example of the Greek state and unilaterally declared their autonomy. And I would say that that move was primarily a political move rather than an ecclesiastical move. However, the case of Bulgaria is a little bit different, not only because of the canonical the case of Serbia is a little bit different, not only because canonically they were granted autocephaly, but also because they were functioning inside an empire. The Pech Patriarchate was abolished, and the population of Middle-Age Serbia moved towards the north and the west. In 1557, the Patriarchate was recreated. At the same time, the patriarchs were the Pasha, the leaders of the Millet, and were representing the people to the port. Serbian patriots, however, participated actively in the revolutions against the Ottomans, and also when there were conflicts between the Ottoman and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, they were always supporting the latter. Therefore, two patriarchates were led the migrant waves towards Austria in 1690 and 1737. After the first migrant wave of the Serbs beyond the Danube, Patriarch Arsenius III asked for religious freedom. He asked to have the spiritual leadership of the Serbs that had migrated with him, but also of the Serbs that were residing in the Ottoman Empire. So, since Leopold I needed the Serbs to function as soldiers, they granted these demands. So the Serbs were living in three different states, but had only one spiritual leader. We have to point out that what Patriarch Arsenius did was not for real nationalist reasons. The Serbs living in Austria were very much exposed to efforts by the Roman Catholic Church to convert to Roman Catholicism. And many Serbs, in fact, became Uniates. So he tried to stop that development. When the Patriarch Arsenius III died, the situation became a little bit better. The Pech Patriarchate was recreated, and now the Serbian Church was moved to the metropolis of Karlovikia, which was under the jurisdiction of the Pech Patriarchate. However, after 1766, that metropolis became autonomous. The Serbs were very active citizens in Austria. However, the religious leaders were receiving their education at the best schools of the empire, and therefore became very much influenced by the Enlightenment ideas in Western Europe. They regarding the idea of national identity, the church was having the spiritual leadership of the people and was helping in create this national identity. In building this national identity, the administrative reform that took place in the 18th century of the metropolis of Karlovikio was very was very important. Up until then, the Serbs were using manuscript in Serbo-Slavonic. After that reform, they imported liturgic books from Russia, because the Russian language was comprehensible to the Serbs. These books were referring to Russian saints and priests and clergy and emperors. They replaced these names with Serbian saints and Austrian emperors, which led to the creation of a pantheon of national saints. The first in this pantheon was, of course, Saint Savas, who was the founder of the Serbian Middle Age state. Once again, there was a historical background in trying to prove that there is a certain continuity in the Serbian nation. After creating this pantheon, they printed liturgical books. The role of the saints in these books is described as the saints being intermediaries between the people and God in the people's struggle for national awakening and its revolutions. Therefore, we see how it was difficult anymore to make the distinction between the church life and the political life, how much the Orthodox identity was identified with the national identity. All these developments happened in a very hostile environment, the environment of the empire, and the church helped in creating the Serbian national identity. The characteristics of sanctity were projected to the nation. Therefore, sacrificing oneself for the nation became an act of faith. The saints receive the characteristical traits of heroes, so the heroes become saints and the saints become heroes. There is a certain resemblance to the situation in Greece. The Serbs, after the First World War, had the opportunity to rectify the situation and separate church with the state, because the kingdom of Serbs, Slovenes, and Croats was created in 1918. Therefore, now that the Serbs are living in one unified country, it was possible to unite all the different churches under the Serbian Patriarchate. However, the Montenegrin metropolis, the Karlovici metropolis, were still functioning autonomously. So, in the lands of the Austrian Empire, the Serbian churches were still functioning autonomously. So, the Serbian Patriarchate and the unification of these churches took place in 1920. Now the Serbs were living in a multi-ethnic, multinational state and had the opportunity to rectify the mistakes they had done in the past. However, they made another mistake and created a purely national church. And with time, they also tried to organize the Serbian diaspora in America. I think it is very much clear how negative this picture of that church had, how negative the image of that church was to the people. And I'm quoting from the Ministry of Culture and Faith of Montenegro in 1906. The Christianity is based on moral values, whereas for us Serbs, it seems to be protecting the state and the Serb national idea, end of quote. However, as we all know, after the collapse of the Soviet Union and of the Federal Yugoslav Republic, many of the nations that were consisting these multi-ethnic states tried to create their own nation states. The Yugoslavia was hiding national differences for many decades. After its collapse, the different nations tried to create their own states. And in this process, religion had a very important role. Even although that religious identity was not important in Yugoslavia. However, we can't say, we should recognize that religion played an important role in the collapse of Yugoslavia. The church and the religious communities did not openly create nationalist sentiment like in the 18th or 19th century. However, both the church and religious authorities were used and instrumentalized by the political authorities. As you know, the Yugoslav Federation had 6 socialist republics and 2 autonomous regions. Minorities were the nationalities consisting Yugoslavia. But all these groups did not have a national narrative or a national identity, a common history. Therefore, they had to invent one. They needed to invent one in order to create their own nation state. And in this process, religion was very much important. An extreme example would be the Muslim national identity. Since 1971, the citizens of Bosnia-Herzegovina that are neither Serbs nor Croats have the right to declare that they have a Muslim national identity. This Muslim national identity, after the wars of the 19th, led to the creation of the Bosnian nation and the Bosniak language. The Orthodox Church was used twice in the creation of a national narrative. One example is the church in the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, and the second example is the Church of Montenegro. After the creation of Fyrom, whose official language is the Slavo-Macedonian, a process for the Church of Fyrom to become autonomous and independent from the Serbian Church began. They asked to become autonomous from the Serbian Patriarchate, and that was granted in 1959. Under political pressure. However, that was not enough, and in 1967 the Orthodox Church of Macedonia declared unilaterally its autocephaly, which was not recognized by any Orthodox Church up until now. When the political situation changed in the 90s and after the 90s, and Fyrom became an independent state, the effort of that church to become autonomous continued. Since 2003, the Serbian Patriarchate was proposing a larger autonomy to be granted to the Orthodox Church of Macedonia and to be granted autocephaly when they are mature enough from an ecclesiastical point of view. Only one bishop was in favor of that proposal, but he was excommunicated and later imprisoned in 2005. And officially, he was imprisoned because of tax evasion, but it remains to be seen whether this is true. We have to admit that the demand for this Fyrom church to become autonomous is more political than ecclesiastical, because it is an effort that is being made in order to give a church, to create a church in a state that does not yet possess an internationally recognized name, but at least to have a language, so let's have a church. The case of Montenegro is different. It is a country that became autonomous and seceded from Yugoslavia just in 2006. There was always a very good relationship between the Serbs and the Montenegrins. It was always a relationship of kinship, and although their paths, their roads were different, the Church of Montenegro has been part of the Orthodox Serbian Church even since the Middle Ages, and even after the abolition of the Peć Patriarchate, and it continued to be part of the Serbian Church after the 1920s. So it was difficult to use this church for nationalist purposes. So what did the nationalists do? They found a different solution. And in 1993, in Chechnya, the old seat of the Metropolitan, they revived the so-called autocephalous Montenegrin Orthodox Church. The Montenegrin Church was at no point in time autocephalous. We can't even find historical documents proving that. The first Metropolitan was Antonio Abramovich, and he was succeeded by Miraš Dedić, who was excommunicated by the Ecumenical Patriarchate. He was in 1997 elected Metropolitan of Montenegro, and he also became the Metropolitan of the Macedonian Orthodox Church. This church is not recognized by any Orthodox church, and at the administrative level it is important to note that essentially it is an NGO that just took the name Montenegrin Orthodox Church. However, it is supported by the state of Montenegro, and its followers believe that the existence of the Montenegrin church is a very important element in the creation of a free Montenegrin nation. They claim that at last they are free, that they have managed to gain their freedom, and this Montenegrin Orthodox Church is trying to construct a national identity by gathering all these people who feel that they have nothing in common with the Serbs and its church, Church of Serbia. But it's clear that this is clearly political and has nothing to do with ecclesiastical life. Now, I personally did some research in the seacoast of Montenegro, and I've seen that the members of this church are trying to show the nationalist aspect of this church. Half of the congregation say that they are Montenegrin as far as their national identity is concerned, but still remain members of the Orthodox Serbian Church. The problem, though, is the state, the Montenegrin state, which needs and wants to create a purely national church. There are Serbs in Montenegro who feel oppressed and see the Serbian church as a way to protect their national oppressed identity. The church in the 20th century, in this militant nationalism, was used. Church narratives were used, and there was a very interesting presentation yesterday let me emphasize some facts only. Since the 1990s, the Orthodox Serbian Church has a better place in society, a better image, and is organizing public events in an effort to publicize its activities more. And they are celebrating St. Lazar of Kosovo, which is a very it's very much linked to national identity in Serbia. I'm not implying that the Church had the objective to to create a national awakening or awaken nationalist sentiments. However, I believe that the Church of Serbia did not understand the historical circumstances and the historical challenges and fell in the trap set up by the politicians who instrumentalized it and used it. And very often it was identified with national identity because right now we have Serbs and the good Serb must be Orthodox. Right now we can hear people saying in my region, people saying he used to be Muslim, but after the war he was baptized as a Serbian, not as an Orthodox. He was baptized as a Serbian. What can we say about that? So, church narratives were integrated in the secular nationalist narratives and were used for the creation of national identity. This was done in the 19th century and is repeated in the second half of the 20th century in the former Yugoslav states. Church narratives were used whenever there was a strong historical precedent. In Skopje, for example, the church is based on the existence of Ohrid. And in Montenegro, they have references to the Middle-Age Serbian tradition. So, in the example of Vojvodina, I think is characteristic. We have 20 nationalities there with so many languages. There are more than 5 different faiths in Vojvodina. If Vojvodina was to become an independent state, Orthodoxy would not have played an important role. However, when national identities were very strong in themselves, or other divisions were very strong in themselves, it was not necessary to use Orthodoxy. Let me finish by saying that the Serbs living in Kosovo have no protection from the Serbian Church. The church Serbian Church is trying to protect the Serbian identity of the people in Kosovo, but I'm wondering whether this might be used by the Serbs in the future to secede from a Kosovar state. So, in other words, may we witness once more the nationalization of churches in the Balkans. Thank you very much.
Now let's move to the presentation of Father Cyril. Thank you. Thank you for, excuse me for my voice. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for this conference. We are often going to many conferences, and we all have experience from this conference that it is something different, something special. And we are having a very serious discussion on issues of nationalism in the church. I've never seen that before in other conferences. And I'm sure that this conference will be remembered as a very important landmark in the resolution of the problem of nationalism in the church. I will read my presentation in English, but the questions and answers.
So my topic is Church and Nation, looking through the glasses of post-secularism. First, I'd like to identify post-secularism. In recent years, sociologists, political scientists, and philosophers started discussing a phenomenon which was coined post-secularism. Post-secularism first was identified as a social phenomenon. Soon after that, thinkers like Jürgen Habermas tried to express it in philosophical terms. At the later stage, theologians joined the discussion trying to understand what sense post-secularism can make for the people of faith. Among the secular intellectuals, this concept became increasingly intriguing, though remained a bit frightening. Theologians were intrigued by it as well. For a couple of centuries, they lived under and were accustomed to the antagonistic dualism between secular and sacral. Nowadays, the demarcation line between the black and the white of secularism and religion has become blurred, and the third option, that of post-secularism, suddenly became possible. Thus, post-secularism appeared to be equally fashionable among those who recently seemed irreconcilable. Following this fashion, today I'd like to attract your attention to this phenomenon. When speaking of post-secularism, I feel a bit dilettante. Nevertheless, the current level of research on the issue is such that one can feel a dilettante and yet dare to write about it without fear of being accused of incompetence. So unelaborated is the field. Soon, I suppose it will be harder to report on the issue without having read a good number of books and articles. A great deal of the current popularity of post-secularism owes to its successful coinage, which features prefix post. Everything you brand with this prefix turns into a profitable product on the market of ideas. The question is whether post-secularism is just a product of successful marketing, or it has its own value as a concept worthy of serious discussions. In my opinion, post-secularism is indeed a successful brand, though not only that. It became successful because researchers and ordinary people recognized a number of things that happen in the society and can be described by this word. Post-secularism describes a range of social developments. I would suggest a too wide range. When speaking of post-secularism, people imply too many things. Some of them mean that religion is coming back to the public life. Some see excessive clericalism and clericalization of the societies. Some religious renaissance. Some phenomenal success of the Christian charismatic movements. Some rediscovering nations' identities and roots. Some Islamic fundamentalism. Some religious terrorism. Some neoconservatism. Some simply conservatism. Some post-liberalism. Some postmodernism, etc. Geography of post-secularism is too wide too. It spreads from the US, with its neoconservatism and war on terror, up to China, with its state-sponsored Confucianism. It includes Russia, with its hypothetical symphony of the church and the state, Middle East with its Arab Spring, which brought Islamist parties to politics, Europe with its failures of multiculturalism, etc. Post-secularism goes really global. It also goes media-friendly. Media puts many faces on it. Those faces may have different expressions: evil, blank, mute, smiling, like those of Osama bin Laden, Andres Breivik, George W. Bush, Vladimir Putin, Dalai Lama, and so on. However differently those faces are taken by public, they are the faces of post-secularism. The polarity of these images underlines the controversiality of post-secularism itself. Post-secularism has too many faces. It has many names. I suspect there are many post-secularisms. Each of them is largely dependent on its cultural, historical, and political context. Therefore, I guess, there are as many post-secularisms as there are contexts in which these post-secularisms find themselves. In my paper, I will stay more on the post-secularism under the circumstances of the post-totalitarian societies, like the one in Russia. A couple of paragraphs ago, I mentioned Russia as having been touched by post-secularism. There, post-secularism can be recognized under different names. For some, for instance, it is a revival of spirituality. For others, it may look like a dangerous clericalization. Both approaches can be explained in terms of post-secularism. Whether the growing public role of religion in the Russian society is seen as a spiritual revival or as an increasing clericalization, it certainly falls under a more general category of the post-secular, which can be observed over the globe. In both camps, of the supporters and of the adversaries of the growing public role of religion in Russia, there are people who share something that can be also characterized as their common post-secular outlook. Namely, it is a dualistic outlook. Indeed, for some people from the supporters' camp, for instance, a century ago, there existed a holy Russia which made everyone happy and smiling and glorifying God. Then crafty enemies infiltrated the innocent flock. By force and deception, they destroyed the holy idyll. Now, the task is to restore at least a weak resemblance of the Russia that existed before the Bolsheviks' revolution. Well, quite a naive picture, isn't it? Those who are against a theocratic imagery of Holy Russia are the enemies of the Church and of Russia. For some, again not all, fortunately, people from the camp of the adversaries, especially those who are still largely under the spell of the communist atheist propaganda, the Church continues to be a danger and should be kept away from the society. Those people are also moved by a dualistic outlook which appears to be, quite surprisingly, a point of convergence of otherwise irreconcilable parties. These visions, however opposite they can be, are popular not only in Russia, but outside it as well, in the countries that share the same post-totalitarian identity. In my opinion, this common feature has to do with the totalitarian past of all these countries. Particularly, it has to do with the dualism so dear to any totalitarian ideology, including the communist one. Indeed, the communist ideology was profoundly dualistic. It separated the entire world into two parts, the part of the proletarians and the part of the capitalists. The former was good by its nature, while the latter was bad also by its nature. The world, seen from the perspective of the communist ideology, was black and white. So the people affected by this ideology are accustomed to see it black and white, even after they have been disappointed by the communist ideology and abandoned it. They converted to different faiths and ideologies, but they largely retained a dualistic outlook on the world around them. This outlook affected the kind of post-secularism developed on the post-totalitarian soil. Dualism is not the only feature of the Russian-style post-secularism. As its other feature, I would identify the ideologization of the Church. Indeed, the era of modernity brought ideologies as the most powerful force capable equally of uniting and separating large groups of people. For almost a century, ideologies occupied the world. Russia is the country which was affected most by this occupation. As a result, nowadays it suffers a lot from the post-ideological syndrome. This is a kind of phantom pain after the official communist ideology was cut off from the body of the society. Not everyone was and remains happy about this. A large part of the society instinctively looks for replacements of the amputated communist ideology. Some of them find this replacement in the Church. In this way, the Church turns into a kind of ideological prothesis to replace the old communist ideology. On the one hand, this gives the Church some extra popularity and attractiveness among those who have accustomed to follow any kind of ideology. Need for an ideology brings many people, if not to the Church itself, at least closer to it. this trend is supported even by some hierarchs who consider the ideologization of the church as a kind of instrument of mission. You will be surprised. On the other hand, by far not everyone who is brought closer to the church through the search for an ideology converts to Christianity. They keep their own beliefs and bring them inside the church, unfortunately. They can even remain atheists and simultaneously call themselves Orthodox. Thus the church, in some of its public manifestations, turns into a sort of political party. No need to say how much it harms the church and its salvific purposes. It also frightens and distracts from the church those who do not want to see the church as an ideological department of the ruling establishment. By turning into a bearer of an ideology, the church loses its missionary potentiality and deviates from its nature and purpose. Ideology once again splits people to parties, now within and around the church. Indicative of this separation is a survey accomplished by the sociological agency Sreda in Russia. They asked people the question whether the recent increase of the activities of the Russian Orthodox Church in the public politics has become excessive. 48% of the respondents disagreed that the activity of the Church is excessive. 27% did not have any opinion about this, and 26% declared that they think that the Church is excessively active in the politics. On the one hand, the number of those who approve the activity of the Church is almost twice more than the number of those who disapprove it. On the other hand, the latter number, 26%, is high enough to be worrying. Who are those who approve and disapprove the increasing public activity of the Church? Are they divided by their attitude to the Church as such, or because they think that the Church is doing something inappropriate? Interesting in this regard is a comment by a well-known Russian journalist who represents the right-wing nationalist ideology, Nikolai Svanidze. When commenting on the above-mentioned survey, he expressed a widely spread opinion that there are expectations, I quote, "There are expectations that the room of ideology, which after the fall of the communist ideology was left empty, can be filled up by Christianity and, in particular, Orthodoxy." End quote. I am afraid that among those who support the public activities of the Church are not only people who want the Christian message to be communicated as wide in the society as possible, but also those who think, like Mr. Svanidze, who wants the Church to play a role of an ideologist. In a similar way, among those who believe that the role of the Church has become excessive are not only atheists and enemies of the Church, so to say, but also those who want the Church to be faithful to its mission to proclaim Christ and not to turn into a political quasi-party. The issue of nationalism and nationality in the life of the Church, which brought us to this conference, should be, I believe, discussed in the light of the just analyzed tendency of making the Church a servant of ideology. And this is a new twist in the perception of nationality in the times of modernity and postmodernity. The post-secular context of nationality in the life of the Orthodox Church is quite different from the historical context in which the ethnic factor started playing its important role for the Orthodox people, well, in the beginning of the 19th century, as we excessively discussed this earlier. To understand the difference, let us go back to the history. Well, nationalism in different concentrations was a feature of the Eastern Christian traditions for a couple of centuries, as we have seen. I am not going to examine here how it was introduced to the Orthodox life. It has been done much better by my colleagues. The matter of fact is that approximately 200 years ago, it became extremely popular among the Orthodox nations when these nations emerged on the historical scene as nations. At that time, ethnic factor served various ends, like helping establishing and justifying national states. It played an important role in shaping a reinvented form of the local church, autocephaly. Here I'd like to support the idea of Paul concerning the phenomenon of autocephaly. Formally, autocephaly is an ancient institution. In fact, however, a new thing was introduced to the Orthodox ecclesiology under the traditional brand of autocephaly, a national independent church. Actually, I believe in many autocephalies, many ideas of autocephaly. The recently emerged idea of autocephaly is quite different from the original one. And even now, if we consider the history of the last 20 or so years, the idea of autocephaly evolved largely, dramatically, but it's a matter for a different discussion. Autocephaly of this kind looks very much like the sovereignty of the national state, and the unity of the local churches became similar to the alliances of the independent nations, something which was justly criticized by the Ecumenical Patriarch. He criticized the present structure of the local churches as a kind of federation of the states, which reflects, I think, the reality, unfortunately. I do not want to say that the marriage of the local church with nationality was only a bad thing, and no one admits this as it can be seen from the discussions. A good thing about it was that the idea of nation facilitated emancipating the very idea of the church, something that we didn't discuss here, and I think it may be a contribution to our discussion, that the idea of national church facilitated the emancipation of the very idea of the church, made it for the Orthodox people more domestic, more dear. Speaking roughly, the Orthodox like the locality of their church. They like both the theological idea of the locality and its incarnations in the real life of the church. They prefer the warmth of the local embodiment of the church to the rather cold idea of the church's universality. A national church was one of the incarnations of the idea of locality. In the 19th century, it kept the church much loved, not just by the dedicated and theologizing Christians, but by all Orthodox people from all classes as well. It helped keeping the Orthodox Christianity a popular religion. When we come back to our time and our topic, the question is whether this attitude to the national churches is valid now, or maybe there is something specifically post-secular in the modern idea of the national church. I believe the idea of a national church went through significant modifications and something post-secular was added to it. This happened because the classical idea of nation, as it was formed after the French Revolution, went through dramatic metamorphosis as well. The main driving force behind this metamorphosis nowadays is their globalization. Having been placed into the metal melting pot of globalization, the idea of nation sounds differently. It turns into a safe harbor for all those who disagree with globalization. Russian Christianity, it's something that we heard from Metropolitan Kallistος on the first day of our discussion. Russian Christians are among the first. They expect that the idea of nation would function as safeguard for their identity and what they call originality, самобытность. In addition, the idea of the national church was greatly modified under the influence of the ideologies of the 20th century. It itself turned into a kind of ideology. It largely lost its sweet smell of the dear and domestic. One can still feel that smell probably in the diaspora, but not so much in the metropolis. The latter, instead of the idea of nationhood, prefer the ideas of a civilization or a world, in quotes, or even an empire. In Russia, for instance, there is a popular idea of a Russian world, so to say, as a conglomerate of the Orthodox nations united by some common features like language, culture, or history. The idea of the Orthodox civilization of a Russian world is post-secular in its purest form and is quite away from the idea of a national church as it emerged 2 centuries ago. I do not want to create an impression that post-secularism is something bad and brings only distortions to the healthy comprehension and practice of Christianity. A positive role of post-secularism, I believe, is that it pushes the Christians to believe reasonably. The era of secular was dominated by the leading role of the ratio. In the post-secular, the ratio retained its important role, though now without monopoly which it enjoyed earlier. that people demand explanations to their beliefs and do not want to take everything for granted is another feature of post-secularism. There are more features to be explored, but in the end, I just wanted to say that it is healthy and it is, I think, appropriate for our discussion to consider the idea of nationhood from this perspective of post-secular. And the idea of nations can be modified and actually evolved recently to other forms, the forms of civilizations under the influence of Toynbee's theories, later on taken on board by Huntington and his colleagues. The ideas of Russian world, as I mentioned, Hellenism, and other constructs that stem somehow from the idea of nationhood, and that function nowadays exactly under the influence, large influence, and in a general framework and context of post-secularism. Thank you for your attention.
To thank both speakers for their very enlightening presentations. I believe that they were, each one of them complemented the other. It is a fact that studying history is important to understand the dialectic relationship between nationality and orthodoxy, and also to understand the instrumentalization and the use of orthodoxy in order to forge national identity. And oftentimes that creation of a national identity meant the oppression of different nationalities that happened to be in the same geographical space. Right now, today, we have managed to recognize and accept that we are living in a multinational, multicultural flux. And it is time to positively view diversity, to accept the existence of multiple nationalities in the same geographical area. But the question is it possible for the Church, through this dialectic relationship between nationality and orthodoxy, to find and reach a different response to national diversity, to ethnic diversity? Is it perhaps also necessary to come to a dialogue with the concepts of human rights? Wouldn't it be a good idea for the Church to use the human rights discourse in order to counter ethnic violence? As Father Cyril said very correctly, globalization is leading us to reconsider and rethink the Orthodox identity in relation to other identities and factors of diversity. Of course, globalization is leading us to a new era, a new reality. We are able nowadays to have a cosmopolitan identity. But at the same time, globalization is also leading to provincialism. Provincialism. So how is it possible for the Church to retain the universal values but at the same time counter such provincialism and demonization of diversity or other negative aspects? I think that history has taught us how ambiguous national identity can be, how easy it is to use it not in favor of the Church's mission, but against this mission. And I believe this is a challenge that we need to debate about, to discuss. The discussion about nationalism and orthodoxy will need some elements from the human rights discourse as a means to limit national identities and its unfortunate consequences when it is instrumentalized. Mr. Kitromilidis. I would like to express my how much impressed I am by the fact that theologians have gone beyond what we political scientists are able to do. They talk about these issues in a much more courageous way. And I have to say that specifically, particularly for Father Cyril, I was impressed by his courage. He said, Father Cyril said, I'm going to pay for that. I'm going to regret that. Mr. Kitromilidis continues. Just a small question for Ms. Tadic. Just a detail I would like one to clarify. When the Pech Patriarchate autocephaly was revoked, and the metropolitans of Montenegro and the second metropolitans lost their reference. Who did they refer to? Who were their spiritual reference? After the abolition of, up until the abolition of the Pech Patriarchate, Karlovicchio and Montenegro were under the jurisdiction of the Pech Patriarchate. De jure, after the abolition, they belong under the jurisdiction of the Ecumenical Patriarchate. However, these metropolises who are inside the Ottoman Empire belong to the Ecumenical Patriarchate. In Austria, the church is organized based on an imperial law in having hierarchical, let's say, assemblies through which they elected their bishops. They always tried to have 4 dioceses, and they elect their bishops. They always have at least 4 bishops. And one out of these 4 ordained bishops becomes the Metropolitan of Karlovici. And why is that? This is because the Ottoman Empire does not allow so the church is not autocephalous de jure, but de facto is operating as if it was. Now, in Montenegro, we have a different situation. They did not accept the abolition of the Pech Patriarchate, and they added to their title, the Bishop of Montenegro, the title of Exarchate of Pech. So he couldn't travel anymore outside. And what did he do? He went to St. Petersburg to get to be ordained. The chair says that he's impressed by the knowledge of the speakers, and Professor
I would like to address a question to Father Cyril. First of all, nice to see you again, and many thanks for your illuminating and courageous analysis. In the past, theologians and philosophers used to say that communism is a reversed version of Christianity. And you are telling us now that for many Russians, the role of the church is to compensate the lack of communism. It seems to me that this is indicative of something, I would say, pathological in the Russian society today. The need for ideology. And usually we need ideologies in order to fill gaps in our collective consciousness or as a sort of mechanism of defense. How can you account for this phenomenon in Russian society today, this need for ideology? I mean, I can explain it in small peoples in the Middle East, for example. Christians in the Middle East need a sort of ideology of rule in order to fill the gaps of their of their own marginalization. But how can you explain it for the Russian people?
Ευχαριστούμε. Θα μαζέψουμε πρώτες ερωτήσεις και μετά θα υπάρχει απάντηση. Ο καθηγητής κ. Μακρύδης και μετά...
I have also a question for Father Cyril. You talked about multi-secularities in plural, and this is the usual tendency to use all these terms, modernity, etc., in plural. The problem is that thereby that sometimes the analytical usefulness of these terms, if we use them in plural, might be lost because everything fits in some way, so the term becomes somehow not very useful. And the point is, you mentioned Habermas and other theoreticians, especially the Western ones. When they talk, first of all, of post-secularism, it is clear that they don't mean the revival or the renaissance of religion. We should distinguish these two. It's very easy to confuse them, but they're not talking about the revival of religion. They're talking, basically, they have in mind all this, what we have discussed in the previous sessions, also yesterday, meaning the whole development of the Western social world and political world, meaning this secular nation state and so on, and they see now some signs that lead them to consider this potential post-secular age. Of course, as you mentioned, Russia is found today in a post-secular situation, but this is again a different one, meaning, of course, after the totalitarianism, this is a post-secular, regardless if we consider communism a quasi-religion or something like this. But again, the two, if I may compare the two situations, are quite different in the terms that, let's say, Russian society, exactly as many other Orthodox societies, have not gone through this development of Western modernity. So they don't have the same experience, and the term doesn't fit, at least in the Western sense, to them. And the problem is, going to Father Klaps's mention of human rights, if we compare the whole debate now, after the text of the Russian Orthodox Church, you know this very well, of 2008, regarding human rights, we do see different positions on the same issue that are not compatible with one another. So I just wanted to say that when we take this terminology, especially from Western theoreticians who actually have a very liberal and so on background, it is not directly, so to say, applicable to a situation in the Eastern Orthodox world. Thank you.
Does it work? Okay, thank you. So I would like to start to continue the previous comments, because I think that in the case at least of these former post-totalitarian churches, it is better, in my view, to speak about post-atheistic, not post-secularist societies. Why? Because first of all, I think that in former totalitarian societies there is a confusion between secularism and atheism. And if secularism somehow reflected or limited only the presence of religion in the public sphere, then in the former atheist societies there was another aim, to annihilate religion even at the level of the personal expression and practice. So I think that maybe this should be taken into account, and to research how this reflects also on our issue about ecclesiology and nationalism, and whether it makes difference this post-secularism in Greek Orthodox society and in Bulgarian, Russian Orthodox societies. I think this could be a very good direction of for future studies. And then as a historian, I should admit that actually we have many national, many histories of national Orthodox churches, but we still haven't a general history of the Orthodox Church, so we face the same problem. So as a historian, I think it is a big methodological problem and issue. And also in the case of the former totalitarian states, somehow historiography during the years of communism didn't pay any attention to church history, so we tend now to present our pre-communist church development as something as an ideal, and like Father Havarun said, Holy Russia, and actually I also was inclined to perceive the Bulgarian church history before communism in the same way, and then I see that it also had problems before the communist regime. So this is also kind of methodological issue. It will be nice to reflect on. Thanks.
His Eminence. Σύντομες, γιατί θα πρέπει να...
Ναι, θα ήθελα να σχολιάσουν οι ομιλητές.
I would like a comment from the speakers on how we could help, how we could see the theological impact and help that could be given to us by the His Eminence Anastasios Giannoulatos. His beatitude. I don't think that the Church's mission is at any time negative when it does not exceed the ecclesiological limits. But the Church should also help at the global level in dealing with social problems, with anyone who has problems in the world, helping for the respect of human rights, etc. Let me remind you the book on globalization that takes the position that there is a theological way to approach human rights.
Father Kirill, I'd like to thank you very much for your very enlightening and courageous talk. But I don't wish to perhaps tempt you to go out further on your limb and then saw it off with this question. But what I would like to know is what you think Father Alexander Men represented in Russian Orthodoxy, and what exactly, well, I'll tell you, start again. I have to launch a book in Australia next month, a new book on Alexander Men. And it's been entitled Martyr for Atheism. And the more I read about Alexander Men, I'm starting to wonder whether he really is a martyr for atheism or a martyr for something else. And I wondered if you would care to comment on perhaps what he was a martyr for. I'm not so sure it was atheism. And I'd like some insight from you on perhaps what he represented in that time of change in Russia.
Ήθελα να ρωτήσω κάτι την κυρία Τάντιτς.
My question is for Ms. Tadic. You presented the relationship between the church and nationalism and the church narratives and nationalism in these areas. You said that these were used, you used quite neutral terms, especially regarding modern era and especially regarding the role of the church in the modern, the latest years. So, do you believe the church was a victim or a villain in the conflicts in Yugoslavia in the recent years? Now, I wanted to ask you something about the Peć metropolis in Kosovo. I also have in mind the Slavic minority in Albania. The ethnic Albanian government of Kosovo will always have problems with the metropolis in Peć. This is my Thank you. I would like to comment on Ms. Tadic's presentation to speak once more about the church narratives in Southeast Europe. Let me say that there is one basic force which amplifies these narratives, which is quite obvious at the beginning of the 19th century. That force is Romanticism. The Greek independence was very important for the impetus that Romanticism gained at the beginning of the 19th century, but throughout the century this affected all these narratives and the history of the region. It is also from a political point of view, Romanticism changed the entire political history of Southeast Europe. So, we may be giving some metaphysical perspective to a historical subject, that is the people. This reminds me very much of the Christian ecclesiological discourse. But let me say, it's much more, it's better from a historical point of view, from a historiographical point of view, to see Romanticism, because Romanticism was managed to create states. It was Romanticism that led to the creation of these states much more than anything else. It was much more but of course Romanticism also existed in France, in Austria, and other countries, in Italy. It is perhaps what the church did was just a shadow of what Romanticism was doing. So are we able to create a soteriological discourse in the church that will go beyond what Romanticism did? Now, very briefly, I would like to say about human rights. I think that we can link that to the Logia operation of St. Paul. St. Paul was trying to preserve the human rights of one specific group, the Gentiles, and what did he do? Practically, he took specific steps in order to create unity. And my second remark regarding what Professor Katan said on why Russians are trying to find refuge in the church in order to fill the gap of the communist ideology, well, I would give the following explanation. Because communism made the mistake of creating a religious view of communism, of making communism a religion. They were referring to Stalin as their father, the father of the nation. So when that state, the Russian state, instead of embracing orthodoxy and trying to embrace the values of orthodoxy, tried to replace it, and I believe this was a huge mistake in the implementation of Marxist ideology. And now that we have the collapse of this ideology, the Russians are seeking a new ideology to base their existence upon. First of all, Father Cyril, and I wonder if they will manage to give answers to everyone.
The questions are very interesting. Thank you very much. In the case of the former Soviet countries, we observe the phenomenon of that modernization was accompanied with a Soviet ideology, which also included the religious element, and this was a kind of conversion of faith. That's why it was able to win. So there is a dialectic in the Hegelian sense, if you like. There is a thesis, a religion. Then this religion was converted into an ideology, and this is the antithesis. And now we have to do a synthesis, if you like, for better or worse. The elements of the traditional religion are combined with the elements of ideology, and there you have this phenomenon that I described in my presentation. In a certain sense, this is a natural development of some non-natural things. That's how it had to be. We had the creation of a Homo Sovieticus, a different kind of man. And how could you change that? So there had to be generations should come so that humanity can revert back to its normal state. So that's how Homo Sovieticus operated. It was an ideological being. And that's why people have recourse to religion, resort to religion in this ideological way. Of course, religion has to work hard in order to be able to overcome this dependence from the ideology. Unfortunately, the Church does not do that very much. Very often it is being carried away by this tendency, unfortunately. And that's why I characterize this phenomenon as post-secularism. It is different from post-secularism as understood by Habermas. Habermas introduced this term, but we have to move away from him. We have to go forward. We have to move from a sociological perspective to a theological perspective. And now theologians have become to be interested in this phenomenon, which was first discovered by the sociologists. And we have to examine the phenomenon from our own perspective. That's why we have to go beyond Habermas. Now we have a bad synthesis between ideology and faith. This is a recent phenomenon. In the Soviet era, this did not exist in the church. The church was really an island free from ideology in the Soviet time. And it was also an island that resisted ideologization, if you like. So the priests who lived at that time, 30 years ago, for instance, remember how the church operated at that time, and they said that we didn't have so much fundamentalism at the time. We didn't have so much ideology within the church. These are all recent phenomena. And they are a result of this inflow of those who were disappointed by communist ideology and entered the church, and they brought their own things with them. This was the era of Alexander Min. At Min's time, there was no such a thing, so he didn't witness ideology, Min. Things were different at the time. This is a complex topic, of course. Once I asked the current Patriarch Cyril what he thinks about Father Min, and he couldn't answer. So we can't understand why he died. We can't know. But he didn't die for the reasons that he would die today. So that's the answer I can give you. I'm not sure I satisfied you. Personally, I don't see developments of the 19th century in a negative light. I think that the church, especially the Serbs, for pastoral reasons, followed the course of history and did what they did. But for me, the tragic thing is that they continue within the same line, even though the world is changing, 150 years have passed, and we are still back with the same stories. And I think that the church should always have a solid foundations which derives from its liturgical life. And then it should be able to explore and understand the challenges of the historical moment. That would be the correct attitude for me. That's why I believe that the Church of Yugoslavia was not a victim, but they were responsible, and they should have understood the challenges of the historical moment, and they should have cared more about their flock rather than their social status. And with regard to Kosovo, I remind you the events of March 2003 when some people burned the Orthodox churches of the 12th century, which are historical monuments, and this was a very regrettable thing. That's the end of our session. Thank you very much. We thank the speakers.